I don't really have great memories from competitions in terms of, yeah, we said just competitions. It's nice that I had them, but what is nicer is that I'm over with them. Uh, I'm grateful to some encounters, I'm grateful to the results, but it's not fun at all, the competitions, and I'm feeling so much more freedom right now without need of participating in competitions, and you never feel peace when you participate in them. It's always some kind of stress and unsettlement. Well, when it's the first album, you somehow start thinking about it when you're a child. You know, when you imagine yourself somehow releasing an album, what can it be possibly? So I don't know, I was probably 11, 12, and I was having lots of ideas and how it can be, of course. They were quite different from my current ideas, but I fell in love somehow with Medtner's music, for example, around the age of 12. And with Cycle, Forgotten Melodies, which is somehow the core piece of the album. I always wanted to record it because I played it a few times, and you know, it's somehow hard to explain to people when you're a teenager why am I thinking that it is the ultimate piano cycle of Russian music. Because of course everyone knows the pictures from the exhibition, the seasons. When you start talking about Medtner, there is always the question who. I'm lucky that I found the people, I found team, I found sound producer who is the same passionate about Medtner, and I was thinking about how to bring him to the world somehow. What can it be? And at the same time, of course, Rachmaninoff being, I guess, a key figure in my early childhood and still, because my mom was not a musician, but she played a lot of music to me, you know, to somehow develop the child's brain, I don't know, with kind of ideas. And when you're not a musician, you somehow choose between Swan Lake and Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto. So I listened to it a lot, to Second Concerto, to Third Concerto, to some preludes. And at some point, I mean, at the age of 3, I guess, I imagined that this is a whole classical music, Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff. And of course, I found out much more about it when I grew up, and I opened his recordings as a pianist later, which are totally mind-blowing and unexplainable to me. And of course, I opened his story, his biography, somehow his personality much more, but still, in my subconscious, it's somehow the ultimate, the first composer I know. Obviously, there is kind of a very visible thread between Rachmaninoff and Medtner, being friends and being kind of very supportive to each other, and they being very high opinion on each other. And Rachmaninoff thought that Medtner is the best composer alive. Somehow you could pretty much solve the similar thinking of them in terms of there is a feeling of nostalgia in Rachmaninoff music and Medtner's music. And if you dig a little deeper into Russian, not even music, but somehow culture, there is always some kind of an imagery world that they create, and they all feel nostalgic about it, which might be never existed, but the writers, the musicians, the painters, the philosophers, there is also always somehow the feeling of unsatisfaction with the modern flow, if I can say. And there was Glazunov, who was living at the same time with Rachmaninoff and Medtner, and they were also kind of closely interacting with each other. Medtner and Glazunov at some point were living in Berlin together and pretty much shared the same view on it, although the life of Glazunov was a little bit more happy, luckily. Still, at the end, he couldn't really deal with the modern flows. He was a boss of St. Petersburg Conservatory, and he couldn't really survive there. And he also left Russia and basically died in a very poor state. Here, not far from here, from Paris. Mikhail Glinka being somehow the godfather of Russian music, and at the same time the godfather of this nostalgic feeling in music, because of course he was very much developed under the European influence. But somehow it's weird to imagine that at some point he was the author of kind of Russian, unofficial Russian anthem, and very much you know, the figure in Russian classical music. And even considering that, he was leaving Russia, he was immigrating with a feeling of resentment, without being able to change the modern flow, at that time modern, of course, compared to Rachmaninoff, it was not modern. But it's weird to imagine that he was basically the first who created this world of singing melody, of Russian music as you can imagine it here in Europe, in America, of Russian motifs, melodies and feelings. And even he felt like an anachronism at the moment, like a person being born in the wrong time. And this is somehow the key thread of the album, with 4 people. It's interesting because even living in Russia with composers, we're kind of tending to create this world of escape from Russia, you know. I mean, it is a feature of any artist somehow to escape into the art. Basically being forced to leave, all 4 of them were being forced to leave. They didn't drastically change the world of their music writing. So somehow it was all created already living in Russia. It was all created under the influence of their older colleagues. Traveling around Europe, traveling around America, you can somehow see the places of Medtner, of Rachmaninoff. Right next to my home there's a place where Glinka died, basically of poverty. I mean, he didn't have food, he didn't have any medicines. There is some influence, you know, when you walk around the street and you imagine these lives. I'm not really creating an analogy between them and myself, but the inspiration, of course, is there by these people kind of who stayed true to themselves, even abroad, and the same true inside Russia and outside. I was very rarely lucky in terms of teacher, because I met my teacher when I was 5, and it was totally by accident in a small music school next to our home, and we basically went a whole path together, like officially for 15 years before I left Russia, and still whenever I have any new program I record it at home and send it here. It is a huge luck, basically the same person who taught me the notes. We learned together all of the core repertoire. In terms of evolution, I started playing on quite big stages when I was 11 and quite a lot as an orchestra. But of course, with the perception of people, hopefully it changes. And now I'm not really remembering it as the greatest experience in terms of it's not feeling much like me. And in a way, I was lucky to have this COVID year and a half without any concerts, kind of isolation, as a border in between with 2 lives, 2 careers, if you want. And at the same time, I left Russia and I kind of built the environment, my practice space, my piano room. I built it as I wanted, and it feels like I'm creating my life, my programs by myself. And it was 3 years ago, I guess. Since that time, I'm feeling much more real, because it doesn't really matter how well you play when you're 11, 12, and I'm watching these old videos, and I mean, it feels cool sometimes, but also I remember how many lessons I had with my teacher, and how many you know, phrases were shown to me, and how well I kind of repeated them from her. In a way, it's all about inner search, and at the same time just repeating whatever was shown to you, and kind of trying to find yourself without people in the audience noticing that you're in a search, being in a search, because people are coming at a concert, they don't really want to know you're being in a search, they want to hear the best experience of their life. Somehow for me as a pianist, it's never really the best experience of my life, not even the best concert on the tour, because I mean, usually they are different, and I play differently, and I'm searching for different things, but it's never the best. It's been quite intense when I played a lot at the age of 11, 12. I'm grateful, but I'm happy that it's different now, and I can do whatever I want. No, just a relationship full of love. Yeah, I mean, it's a bit stupid thing to say, but I do think that Russian pianists are the best in the world, I mean, in terms of history. Like people like Emil Gilels or Vladimir Sofronitsky, they somehow influenced me hugely, and Rachmaninoff himself. And I studied at Moscow Conservatory for a little bit, and it feels so cool, you know, because you can still see the same rooms where I studied, where they taught. Metner as well, he was a teacher at the conservatory in Moscow. It feels cool. It's not feeling very evolutionary in terms of like nowadays, because it's a bit lost and spread it. The Russian school and all the other schools is globalization, and it's not a bad thing, but I feel like it's kind of ended at some point with the Soviet Union, which is all right. It's nice to be able to touch with old tradition, also because, I mean, even people like Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky, I feel like we were influenced and we were raised on the same nature landscapes, on the same literature, on the same language, on the same music, like I don't know, Orthodox Church music, for example. It's something that you hear much before you realize what you want to do in life. And so this common experience, it is very much bonding. I listen always to a lot of music, not only piano. I love orchestral music, I love violoncello. I love some unknown repertoire also because, especially now, living in Europe, Russian music is such a huge amount of unknown literature. Like, and there is kind of no one around to dig into it. So, and whenever you just touch it flourishing and opens itself, and it won't be played. And this album, for example, is kind of a little piece of this pie, and there is quite a lot of unknown but amazing music on this album. I listened a lot to all the Soviet pianists. Well, now I basically listen to everything which is coming out, whatever. Because I know all my colleagues, so it feels like listening to friends. So I love listening. Whenever I'm not practicing, I'm listening to something in my headphones. Yeah, anything. Just it's important for me to have some music in my ears. Meeting conductors is somehow very helpful and teaching in a way of I think any concerto which is in my repertoire is somehow a bunch of experiences with different conductors, a bunch of ideas from their minds. Sometimes I really value, you know, there is always a meeting with a conductor planned before the rehearsal. Usually it's like 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And sometimes it happens to be a little longer. And then the conductor has something to say, and even more, sometimes I disagree. It goes in the chest together with all the other ideas and kind of blends together and creates something beautiful sometimes. I remember I played once with Michael Tilson Thomas, and we spent like 3 hours at the conductor meeting on Rachmaninoff Third. And whenever whenever I play Rachmaninoff Third, I feel like a piece of him in there. And it's a cool feeling. Definitely collaborations are a great inspiration, especially I was liking it so much in Russia, because in Russia chamber music is not a thing at all. And whenever I came to Germany, it felt like the opposite, because Germany is the basement of chamber music. Also pianists, in a way, it's only the loneliest kind of musician, because we tour a lot for recitals. And we see new people every day, and we practice a lot alone, and there's no other instrument like that. Firstly, it should be, I'm feeling happy when I practice alone, but playing chamber music is a way to exchange ideas, to exchange views, to exchange somehow human energy. I would say Rachmaninoff is on the top of the list. Also, because of personality, the way he plays. Somehow fashionable to criticize him as a composer because he's a bit of repetitive if you play all of his music in a row. And as a musicologist, I guess you can really write down how he did it, how he wrote these melodies which are so touchy and so pop style sounding, which is true, but it's still working perfectly. But as a pianist, especially in Russian school, you know, my teachers, we were always crazy about technical stuff and how it's done, and analyzing how other great pianists did this or that thing. And when I listened to Rachmaninoff, even though he left quite small legacy of recordings, I can't really explain how he did it, like the Carnival by Schumann. I think it is the best recording ever done. Although it's not perfect, it's not really edited, but the fact that I can't really explain the technical side of it, it says that I want to listen again and again, and it's a bit of addictive. He's not much of a historical pianist. It feels like he's still around. Again, as a Russian person, definitely one of not Russian pianists who somehow entered the line of Russian pianists is Van Cliburn. And definitely he's one of the Rachmaninoff third interpreters. And I mean, obviously Vladimir Horowitz, but it's basically, he died just recently, and he still remembers Rachmaninoff, so it feels like a modern music pretty much to me.